In the summer of 63 BC, a Roman senator named Marcus Livius stood trembling in the Forum Romanum, wearing nothing but a transparent linen tunic that left him effectively naked before thousands of Romans, who had once called him colleague and friend. His senatorial shoes had been removed. His toga, the garment that marked him as a Roman citizen of the highest class, had been stripped away. His hands were bound behind his back, and in his mouth was a wooden bit, the kind used on horses, forcing his jaw open so he could not speak in his own defense. A herald stood beside him, reading from a scroll, listing Marcus's crimes: embezzlement of public funds, bribery of magistrates, betrayal of the Senate's trust. After each accusation, the herald paused, and a man with a flagrum, a multi-tailed whip tipped with metal, struck Marcus across his back. The crowd counted each strike. 1, 2. By the 10th strike, Marcus was weeping openly, his humiliation complete before the physical punishment had barely begun. By the 20th strike, he had collapsed to his knees. By the 30th, he was begging incoherently through the bit in his mouth for mercy that would not come. Marcus Livius survived that day. The beating was not designed to kill him. It was designed to destroy something far more important than his body. It was designed to destroy his dignitas, his honor, his social existence as a Roman man of rank. And it succeeded completely. Within a week, Marcus had killed himself, not because of his injuries, which were healing, but because he could not bear to continue living in a world where thousands of people had watched him, reduced to something less than human, something less than a man, something that wept and begged and broke before their eyes. This was not unusual. This was Roman justice. This was what happened to people who violated the social order in a civilization that believed honor was more valuable than life itself, that believed humiliation was a more effective punishment than execution, that believed destroying a person's reputation and dignity was the most complete form of justice available. This is the story of the most horrific public humiliations in ancient Rome. These are not the clean deaths you see in movies, the noble falls on swords or dignified poisonings. These are the punishments designed specifically to strip away everything that made a person Roman, everything that gave them identity and status and humanity. These are the rituals that went so far that even Romans themselves sometimes questioned whether the cruelty had exceeded the crime. And these are the testimonies preserved in historical sources of people who experienced or witnessed humiliations that were considered worse than death itself. Before we continue, I need you to understand what you are about to hear. The Romans documented their methods of public humiliation in legal texts, in historical chronicles, in the writings of philosophers who debated the ethics of these punishments. The sources exist. The practices I will describe are attested in ancient documents, though I will use composite characters to make comprehensible what the records document, but do not fully explain. If you want to understand how honor-based societies enforce social control through systematic humiliation, how punishment can be designed to destroy identity rather than just body, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you are from, and whether your culture has concepts of honor and shame that you inherited from ancient traditions. Now let us go back to Republican Rome and understand why humiliation was considered the ultimate weapon. Roman society in the late Republic and early Empire was organized around a complex system of social status, honor, and public reputation. A Roman's identity was not primarily individual in the modern sense. It was relational, defined by how others perceived and treated you. Your dignitas, your honor and standing depended on maintaining the respect of your peers and the difference of your inferiors. Lose that respect, that difference, and you effectively ceased to exist as a social being even if you physically survived. The concept of dignitas was not abstract. It had concrete manifestations in daily life. Elite Romans, with high dignitas, received preferential seating at public events. They were greeted with respect in the streets. Their opinions carried weight in Senate debates. They could expect favorable treatment in legal disputes. They had access to patronage networks that provided economic and political opportunities. All of this depended on maintaining their honor, on being perceived as worthy of respect. For elite Romans, particularly senators and equestrians, honor was tied to multiple factors. Your ancestry and family name mattered enormously. Romans kept a detailed genealogies and could recite their ancestors' achievements going back generations. A man from an old patrician family started with inherited dignitas that a new man, someone whose family had not previously held high office, had to work much harder to achieve. Your wealth and property were also crucial. Romans expected elite men to display their wealth appropriately, not through ostentatious consumption, which was considered vulgar, but through public benefactions, sponsoring games and festivals, building public works, and maintaining an impressive household. A senator who fell into poverty lost dignitas regardless of his family background or past achievements. Your military achievements and public service added to your honor. Romans valued martial courage and success. A man who had commanded armies successfully, who had won battles and triumphs, gained enormous dignitas. Public offices also conveyed honor. Being elected consul, the highest magisters, marked the pinnacle of a political career and conferred permanent status. Your conduct in personal relationships mattered as well. Romans expected elite men to be faithful to their word, to maintain their client relationships appropriately, to show proper deference to superiors while maintaining dignity with equals and displaying appropriate authority over inferiors. A man who broke his word, who abandoned his clients, or who acted servile toward equals, lost dignitas even if his wealth and ancestry remained intact. Your ability to command respect through gravitas, that quality of seriousness and dignity that elite Romans were expected to project at all times, was perhaps most important of all. A senator who lost his gravitas, who was publicly ridiculed or humiliated, who showed weakness or loss of self-control, could not function in Roman society. Other senators would not take him seriously. The people would not respect him. His political career was over. His family's reputation was damaged. In many cases, the dishonored person chose suicide, as preferable to continuing to live in a state of permanent shame. For common Romans and for slaves, honor worked differently, but was no less important. Free Roman citizens, even poor ones, had rights that slaves did not have. They could not be tortured or subjected to certain degrading punishments without trial. They could appeal to tribunes for protection. They could vote and participate in public assembly. They had legal standing to bring cases and defend themselves in court. These rights marked them as part of the Roman citizen body, as people who belonged to the community. Punishments that stripped away these markers of citizenship, that treated citizens as if they were slaves or foreigners, were deeply humiliating and socially destructive. For free citizens, honor also related to occupational status and reputation within their community. A craftsman took pride in his work and his reputation among fellow craftsmen. A merchant valued his reputation for honest dealing. A soldier valued his courage and loyalty to his unit. Even poor Romans had concepts of personal honor and dignity that could be attacked through public humiliation. Being mocked in the streets, being forced to beg publicly, being subjected to punishments normally reserved for slaves. All of these destroyed a free citizen's sense of worth and belonging. For slaves, honor was even more precarious. Slaves had almost no legal protection. They could be beaten, tortured, violated in various ways, or killed at their master's discretion with minimal legal consequences. But even slaves had some conception of personal dignity, some sense of self-worth that masters could target for destruction. Punishments designed to humiliate slaves, to make them feel worthless and broken, were considered more effective for maintaining control than simple violence. A slave who had been successfully humiliated, who had internalized their own worthlessness, would be less likely to rebel than a slave who had merely been beaten, but whose spirit remained intact. The Roman state understood all of this. Roman law and custom had developed elaborate systems of punishment designed not just to inflict pain or cause death, but to destroy honor and reputation in ways that served as deterrents and as public demonstrations of state power. These humiliation rituals served multiple functions simultaneously. They punished individuals who had violated social norms. They reinforced the hierarchies of Roman society by showing what happened to people who challenged those hierarchies. They provided entertainment for the masses who enjoyed watching the downfall of the mighty, or the suffering of criminals and slaves. And they created shared public experiences that bound Romans together through collective witnessing of justice. Understanding these functions helps explain why Romans invested so much effort in elaborate public humiliations. A simple execution could achieve the goal of removing a criminal from society, but it would not provide the same deterrent effect, the same reinforcement of social hierarchies, the same public entertainment, or the same community bonding that an elaborate multi-stage humiliation ritual could provide. Romans were not just punishing criminals. They were performing social order, demonstrating visually and memorably how that order was maintained and what happened to those who violated it. Let me give you context for the punishments I'm about to describe by explaining the most important concept in Roman society: virtus. This word is usually translated as virtue or manliness, but it meant something more specific and more complex than either of those English terms suggests. Virtus was the quality that made a Roman man a man. It included courage in battle, the willingness to face danger without flinching. It included self-control, the ability to master one's emotions and appetites rather than being mastered by them. It included dominance over others, the ability to command and be obeyed. And most importantly, it included inviolability, the quality of being untouchable, unable to be dominated or violated by others. A man with virtus could not be dominated. He was the actor, not the acted upon. He was the one who gave orders, not the one who received them in servile fashion. He was the one who imposed his will on others, not the one whose will was overridden. This conception of virtus was deeply tied to Roman social and military hierarchies. In battle, a Roman soldier with virtus fought bravely and dominated the enemy. In politics, a Roman senator with virtus commanded respect and influenced decisions. In household management, a Roman pater with virtus controlled his family, slaves, and clients with firm authority. This concept of virtus was also deeply tied to Roman ideas about the body and physical violation. Elite Roman men were expected to be physically inviolable in certain specific ways. Their bodies were not to be violated, touched without permission, or subjected to treatment that suggested subordination. This inviolability was expressed through various social customs. Elite Romans maintained physical distance from inferior. They did not allow themselves to be pushed or jostled in crowds. They expected others to move out of their way on the streets. Physical contact initiated by inferiors was considered presumptuous unless explicitly invited. The violation of this physical inviolability, whether through violence, through forced intimacy, or through other means of bodily degradation, was deeply shameful and could destroy a man's virtus. This is why many of the most devastating Roman humiliations involved forcing elite men into positions of physical vulnerability or subjection. To have your body violated, to be treated as if you were a slave or a woman rather than a free elite male, was to lose virtus, to cease being a proper Roman man, to become something shameful and despised. Women had a different relationship to honor and a different set of expectations. Elite Roman women were expected to embody polygamy, which encompassed modesty, chastity, and appropriate feminine behavior. A woman's reputation depended on her intimate virtue, on remaining chaste before marriage and faithful after marriage. But polygamy also involved proper comportment in public, avoiding behavior that drew inappropriate attention, maintaining the dignity appropriate to her family's status, and conducting herself in ways that reflected well on her husband and family. Elite women had some avenues for gaining honor and respect within the constraints of their gender. They could be recognized as exemplary wives and mothers. They could gain respect for managing large households efficiently. They could earn admiration for religious devotion and for participation in women's religious rituals. Some elite women, particularly those from very powerful families or those who were widowed and controlled significant property, could exercise considerable influence in politics and business, though always indirectly through male relatives or associates. But a woman's honor was always more fragile than a man's. A false accusation of adultery could destroy a woman's reputation, even if not proven. Being seen alone with a man who was not a relative could raise questions about her virtue. Any suggestion of improper intimate behavior was socially devastating. This vulnerability meant that punishments for women often involved destroying polygamy, either through actual violation or through rituals that suggested impropriety. A woman whose polygamy was destroyed could not return to her former social position. She was ruined permanently, unable to marry respectably or maintain relationships with elite families. Lower status women, including slaves and freed women, had different standards applied to them. They were not expected to maintain the same level of polygamy as elite women. In fact, Romans assumed that lower status women were more likely to be promiscuous or to engage in transactional intimacy. But even these women had some conception of honor and being forced into situations that were degrading even by the standards applied to their class, being subjected to public mockery or violation, being treated as completely worthless, could be psychologically devastating, even for women who had no expectation of being treated with the dignity accorded to elite matrons. With this context established about Roman honor culture, about Verdician polygamy, about the complex hierarchies of status and dignity, we can now examine the specific methods of humiliation that Romans developed and deployed. I will describe 8 major categories of humiliation, punishment, each one designed to destroy a different aspect of Roman identity and honor. And I will use composite characters built from fragments in historical sources to show what these punishments meant in human terms. The first punishment we need to examine is what sources call the tuna molesta, combined with public confession and flogging. This was used primarily against elite men who had betrayed public trust, particularly senators and magistrates convicted of corruption, embezzlement, or treason. The punishment was not execution. It was systematic destruction of honor through a multi-stage ritual that stripped away every marker of elite status and replaced them with markers of shame. Let me tell you about Marcus Livius, the senator I mentioned in the opening. Marcus is a composite character based on several documented cases of senators who underwent similar humiliations in the late Republic. His specific story combines elements from multiple sources to illustrate how this punishment worked in practice. Marcus had been a senator for 15 years, elected to office through a combination of family connections, military service on the German frontier, and careful cultivation of political allies. He owned property in Rome and a villa in Campa. He had a wife from a respectable family and 3 children. He was not exceptionally wealthy or powerful, but he was solid, respectable, someone the Senate could depend on for reasonable judgment and reliable votes. He attended Senate meetings regularly. He sponsored modest games during his year as edile. He maintained appropriate relationships with his clients and patrons. In every visible way, Marcus embodied the dignitas expected of a Roman senator. But Marcus made mistakes that would eventually destroy him. He accepted bribes from contractors seeking public works projects. The bribes were not enormous, but they were substantial enough to make a real difference to Marcus's finances. He used the money to pay off debts incurred through living beyond his means, to purchase better furnishings for his townhouse, to sponsor slightly more elaborate games than he could have afforded otherwise. He told himself that what he was doing was not really corruption, that everyone accepted such gifts, that he was simply being pragmatic about the realities of Roman politics. He also embezzled funds that were supposed to go to grain distributions for the poor. Again, the amounts were not massive, but over several years they accumulated to a significant sum. Marcus diverted the money to various personal expenses, always planning to repay it eventually, but never quite managing to do so. He told himself that the grain distributions would not really be affected, that the shortfalls could be covered from other sources, that the poor would not really notice the difference. But Marcus's crimes were discovered. An ambitious prosecutor looking to make a name for himself began investigating irregularities in the grain distribution accounts. He traced the missing funds to Marcus and also uncovered evidence of the bribery. Marcus was brought before a special court established to investigate senatorial corruption. He tried to defend himself, arguing that the charges were exaggerated, that he had made bookkeeping errors rather than deliberately stealing, that the prosecutor was motivated by personal enmity rather than concern for justice. The court was not persuaded, for multiple witnesses testified about the bribes they had paid. The accounting records clearly showed the embezzlement. Marcus's defenses were weak and unconvincing. He was convicted on all charges. The punishment prescribed by law was not death. It was public humiliation designed to serve as warning to other senators who might be tempted by similar corruption. The punishment began with Marcus being summoned to the forum on market day, when the space would be crowded with thousands of people. He was told to come wearing his senatorial toga, the garment that marked his rank and status. The white wool toga with the purple stripe was the most visible symbol of senatorial dignity. Wearing it, Marcus could move through Rome with the respect and deference that his position commanded. But he would not be wearing it for long. When Marcus arrived at the forum, he found a large crowd already assembled. Word had spread that a senator was to be publicly punished, and Romans loved such spectacles. They enjoyed seeing the mighty brought low, enjoyed the entertainment that public humiliation provided, enjoyed the feeling of collective judgment at these events created. Marcus walked through the crowd to the designated area, aware that thousands of eyes were watching him, aware that what was about to happen would be witnessed and remembered and discussed throughout Rome. A herald stood on a raised platform. When Marcus reached the designated spot, the herald began reading the verdict of the court in a loud, clear voice that carried across the forum. Marcus Livius, senator of Rome, having been convicted of crimes against the Roman people, specifically the acceptance of bribes and the embezzlement of public funds intended for grain distributions to the poor, is hereby stripped of his dignitas and subjected to public correction. The word used was correctia, suggesting this was meant to correct and reform rather than simply punish, though everyone understood the real purpose was humiliation and deterrence. As the herald finished reading the verdict, attendants approached Marcus. These were public slaves assigned to carry out punishments. They were not gentle. One grabbed Marcus's toga and began pulling it away from his body. Marcus instinctively tried to resist, holding on to the garment, but the attendant roughly yanked it from his grasp. The toga, the symbol of Marcus's citizenship and rank, was removed and tossed aside. The crowd watched this, stripping with intense interest. Some jeered. Others remained silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the attendants removed Marcus's senatorial shoes, the special red leather calfsleeve that marked him as a member of the Senate. These shoes were another visible marker of status. Only senators wore such footwear. Removing them reduced Marcus from senator to common citizen, stripped of the visual symbols that commanded respect. Marcus was left standing in his tunic, the simple undergarment worn by all Romans regardless of status. But this was not enough. The attendants had brought a special tunic, what sources call the tuna molesta, the tunic of distress or shame. This garment was deliberately designed to humiliate. It was made of thin, nearly transparent linen that provided no real covering. When Marcus was forced to remove his regular tunic and put on the tunica lesta, his body became visible to everyone in the forum. Romans could see the outline of his form, could see details that should have been modestly covered. For an elite Roman man, this exposure was profoundly shameful. Elite men were expected to be modest in public, to keep their bodies covered, except in appropriate contexts, like the baths where nudity was expected and normal. This involuntary exposure, particularly exposure that revealed the body to the gaze of social inferiors including women and slaves, was feminizing and degrading. Elite Roman men controlled who could see their bodies and in what context, having that control taken away, being forced to display himself before thousands of people including those he would normally command and dominate, suggested a reversal of the normal social order. Marcus stood there knowing that thousands of people, including women and slaves and common citizens, were looking at his nearly naked body, judging it, mocking it, seeing him in a state of vulnerability that destroyed the gravitas he had spent years cultivating. The physical vulnerability suggested metaphorical vulnerability, a loss of the masculine inviolability that Virtus required, but the humiliation had only begun. An attendant handed Marcus a scroll and told him to read it aloud to the assembled crowd. Marcus's hands shook as he took the scroll. He unrolled it and saw that it contained his confession, a detailed list of every crime he had committed, written in clear language that left no room for ambiguity or excuse. He was required to describe his own corruption in his own voice before thousands of witnesses. This forced confession served multiple purposes. It confirmed the legitimacy of his conviction, making clear that the punishment was deserved rather than arbitrary. It created a permanent record in the memories of thousands of witnesses, who would remember not just that Marcus had been convicted, but that he had confessed in his own words. It stripped away any possibility of claiming innocence or arguing that the verdict had been unjust. And most importantly, it forced Marcus to participate in his own destruction, to be complicit in the annihilation of his honor. He was not just being punished, he was being forced to condemn himself. Marcus began reading in a voice that cracked with emotion. I, Marcus Livius, confessed before the Roman people that I have betrayed the trust placed in me as senator. I accepted bribes from contractors, seeking public works projects. I embezzled funds designated for grain distributions to the poor. I used these stolen funds for my personal benefit, to maintain a lifestyle I had not earned, to present a false appearance of wealth and success. I betrayed my fellow senators. I betrayed the Roman people. I betrayed the honor of my family and ancestors. I deserve the punishment I am about to receive. Marcus had to pause several times during this reading to compose himself. His voice broke. Tears ran down his face. He had to stop and wipe his eyes before he could continue. The crowd listened in silence at first, drinking in every word of his confession. Then someone shouted an insult. Thief, traitor, corrupt dog. Others joined in. By the time Marcus finished reading the scroll, the forum was filled with the sound of thousands of Romans mocking a senator who had betrayed them. This collective mockery was itself a punishment, a demonstration that Marcus had lost the respect of the people he had supposedly served. The jeering continued, as Marcus was taken to a whipping post that had been erected in the center of the forum specifically for public punishments. The post was wooden, thick, and solid, set deep into the stone pavement. Iron rings were attached near the top. Marcus's hands, still shaking, were bound with ropes that were then threaded through the rings, pulling his arms above his head and forcing him to stand on his toes. The position was uncomfortable immediately, and would become agonizing as the punishment continued. An attendant approached with a wooden bit, similar to what would be placed in a horse's mouth. This was forced between Marcus's teeth, the wood pressing painfully against his jaw, held in place by leather straps tied behind his head. The bit served two purposes. It prevented Marcus from biting his own tongue during the beating, which might cause him to bleed to death, something that would interfere with the goal of keeping him alive to fully experience the humiliation. But more importantly, the bit prevented Marcus from speaking, from pleading for mercy, or cursing his punishers, or saying anything that might allow him to maintain some shred of dignity. He was reduced to animal sounds, grunts and moans, muffled by the bit, unable to form words. A man skilled in the use of the flagrum took position behind Marcus. The flagrum was a whip specifically designed for this type of punishment. It consisted of a handle attached to multiple leather thongs, typically 3 or 4 straps, each about 2 feet long. At the end of each thong were small metal pieces, bits of lead or bronze shaped to tear flesh. The flagrum was not designed to kill. It was designed to cause maximum pain while allowing the victim to survive. The multiple thongs spread the impact across a wider area than a single whip would, reducing the likelihood of hitting the same spot repeatedly, which could cause lethal damage. The metal tips tore skin and caused significant pain and bleeding, but generally did not penetrate deeply enough to cause fatal injuries. The herald announced that Marcus would receive 30 lashes. This number was significant. It was severe enough to be memorable and painful, but not so severe that it risked killing the condemned man. The flogging was counted publicly. The herald called out each number as the lash fell. 1. The first strike landed across Marcus's shoulder. The thin tuna molesta provided no protection. The leather thongs and metal tips bit into his flesh, tearing the fabric and the skin beneath. Marcus's body jerked against the ropes. A muffled scream escaped around the bit in his mouth. The second strike landed slightly lower across his upper back. More skin tore. Blood began running down Marcus's back, soaking into the transparent tunic and making it cling to his body. 3, 4, 5. The strikes continued in steady rhythm. The man wielding the flagrum was experienced and methodical. He knew how to pace the beating to maximize pain without causing unconsciousness or death. He varied the angle and position of each strike slightly to avoid concentrating damage in one area. By the 10th lash, Marcus's back was torn open in multiple places. Blood ran down his back and legs, dripping onto the forum stones. He was screaming continuously now, muffled sounds that came from deep in his throat, sounds of agony that he could not control or suppress. His body thrashed against the ropes holding him to the post. He pulled helplessly at his bonds, trying instinctively to escape pain that could not be escaped. By the 20th lash, Marcus was weakening visibly. His legs could no longer support him properly. He hung from the ropes attached to the post, his full weight suspended by his bound wrists. The crowd continued counting along with the herald, their voices becoming a collective chant. 21, 22, 23. Some in the crowd seemed to be enjoying the spectacle, cheering with each strike. Others watched in grim satisfaction, believing that justice was being done. A few looked uncomfortable, but did not leave or protest. By the 30th and final lash, Marcus had collapsed completely. Only the ropes held him upright. His back was a mass of torn flesh and blood. The transparent tunic was completely saturated with blood, clinging to his body and making visible the extent of the damage. His face was contorted with pain. Tears and mucus ran down his face, mixing with the drool that escaped around the... And then, as the herald announced the completion of the 30 lashes, Marcus lost control of his bladder. Urine ran down his legs, mixing with the blood pooling on the stones beneath him. This loss of bodily control was deeply significant. Elite Romans were expected to maintain composure even under extreme stress. Self-control was a fundamental aspect of virtue. Men were supposed to master their bodies, not be mastered by them. Weeping in public was acceptable only in very specific contexts, like funerals where emotional display was expected and appropriate. But losing control of bodily functions, wetting oneself like a child or an animal, was deeply shameful. It suggested weakness, lack of self-mastery, inability to maintain the dignity expected of a Roman man. Marcus's public breakdown, his screaming and weeping and loss of bodily control confirmed what the punishment was designed to prove. He was not a man of virtue. He was weak, corrupt, unable to maintain the self-control and dignity expected of a senator. Every person who witnessed his collapse would remember it. Every time they saw him in the future, if they saw him at all, they would remember the senator who wept and lost control of himself during his flogging. The memory would be permanent and defining. After the 30th lash, attendants cut Marcus down from the post. He collapsed immediately to the ground, unable to stand. His legs would not support him. His back was torn and bleeding. He lay on the forum stones in a growing pool of his own blood and urine, gasping for breath around the bit that was still in his mouth. An attendant removed the bit, throwing it aside. Another attendant threw a bucket of water on Marcus, washing away some of the blood and urine, cleaning him enough that he would not leave too much mess as he was removed from the forum. Then came the final humiliation of the punishment ritual. Marcus was told to leave the forum, but he was not permitted to walk upright. He was forced to crawl on his hands and knees like an animal while the crowd watched and jeered. Attendants kicked him when he moved too slowly. The crowd spat on him as he passed. Some threw rotten food or filth. Children ran alongside him, shouting insults and mockery. Marcus crawled the length of the forum from the whipping post to the exit, while thousands of Romans watched his degradation. This crawling completed the destruction of his status. He was leaving the space of Roman public life, not as a senator walking upright with dignitas, maintaining the gravitas expected of his position, but as something less than human, an animal or a slave, broken and beaten, and reduced to the most abject position imaginable. The image of Marcus crawling through the forum, bloody and broken and covered in his own waste, would be the lasting memory that Romans would associate with his name. Marcus survived the physical punishment. His wounds, though extensive, were not life-threatening. Over the following weeks, his back began to heal. The torn flesh scarred, the pain gradually diminished. But Marcus did not survive socially. The destruction of his dignitas was complete and irreversible. Other senators avoided him. They would not speak with him in public. They would not acknowledge him when they passed him in the streets. His political allies abandoned him, not wanting to be associated with someone who had been so publicly disgraced. His wife's family pressured for divorce to protect their own reputation from the stain of Marcus's dishonor. His children faced mockery at school from other elite children who had heard their parents discussing the senator who had been flogged and who had wept and crawled through the forum. Marcus tried for several days to continue his normal routine. He went to the baths. He visited the forum. He attempted to maintain social connections, but everywhere he went, he felt the stares and heard the whispers. People pointed at him. They made comments loud enough for him to hear. There goes the senator who stole from the poor. There goes the man who crawled through the forum like a dog. Marcus realized that his life, as he had known it, was over. He could never recover the dignitas he had lost. He would spend the rest of his life as an object of contempt and mockery. 7 days after the flogging, Marcus killed himself by cutting his wrists in his back. He left no note, but everyone understood why life as a dishonored former senator was not worth living. Death was preferable to permanent shame. His family buried him quietly with minimal ceremony. No eulogy was given. No one praised his accomplishments or mourned his loss. He had died in shame, and his shame followed him even into death. His name became a cautionary tale, something other senators referenced when discussing corruption. Do not be like Marcus Livius, they would say. Do not betray your position and face the flogging. If you are hearing this story and understanding that Roman society was built on systems of honor and shame that could be weaponized to destroy people without killing them, that psychological destruction was considered a more complete form of punishment than simple execution, then share this video, hit that like button to help others find this content, and tell me in the comments what you think about honor-based systems of justice. Are they more or less cruel than modern punishments that focus on imprisonment? Can psychological destruction ever be justified as punishment? Does your culture still have elements of honor and shame that function similarly to Rome? Let me know your thoughts. Now let me tell you about an even more elaborate humiliation ritual. The preparation ceremony before the cullis execution. A punishment so bizarre that it sounds like medieval legend, but is well documented in Roman legal sources. The cullis was Rome's most infamous method of executing parasites, people who killed their parents or close family members. The punishment involved sewing the condemned into a leather sack along with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, then throwing the sack into a river to drown. This bizarre combination of animals was symbolic. Each represented a quality that the parricide had violated. The dog represented loyalty betrayed because dogs were symbols of faithful service to masters. The rooster represented morning light and renewal denied, because the parasite had cut short a life that should have continued. The snake represented hidden evil, the secret venom that killed from within. The monkey represented a mockery of humanity, a creature that resembled humans but lacked human virtue. But what is less well known is that the cullis execution was the end point of a multi-day process of systematic humiliation designed to break the condemned person before death and to provide public spectacle that reinforced social norms about family loyalty. The days leading up to the cullis were filled with rituals that stripped away the condemned person's identity as a Roman and transformed them into something bestial and unworthy before they were killed. Let me tell you about Gas Publish, a composite character based on several documented cases of parasite prosecutions in the late Republic and early Empire. Gas was 32 years old when he killed his father during a dispute over inheritance. The murder was not premeditated. It happened during a violent argument that had been building for months over Gas's father's refusal to allow Gas access to family property. The argument escalated. Both men were shouting. Gas's father said something particularly cutting about Gas's failures as a son. Gas, in a moment of rage, struck his father with a heavy bronze lamp. The blow was intended to hurt and silence, not necessarily to kill. But Gas's father fell badly, hitting his head on the corner of a stone table. He died within minutes, but the result was the same as if Gas had planned the murder carefully. His father was dead by Gas's hand. Under Roman law, this was parricide, the most heinous crime imaginable because it violated the fundamental structure of Roman society. The pater familia, the male head of household, had absolute authority over his family. His word was law within his household. For a son to raise his hand against his father was to challenge the most basic principle of Roman social order. If sons could kill fathers with impunity, if the authority of the parafamilies could be violated, then the entire structure of Roman society was threatened. Gas was arrested immediately by neighbors who had heard the argument and came to investigate. He was brought before a special court that handled parasite cases. These cases were treated with particular seriousness because of what they represented. The trial was brief. Multiple witnesses had heard the argument. Several had seen Gas strike his father or had arrived immediately after to find Gas standing over his father's body. Gas's guilt was undeniable. He tried to argue that it had been an accident, that he had not intended to kill, that the punishment should reflect the lack of premeditation. The court was not sympathetic. Intent mattered less than result. A father was dead by his son's hand. That was parricide, and parricide demanded the most severe punishment Rome could devise. The court sentenced Gas to death by cullis, but the execution was scheduled for 3 days later, and those 3 days would be filled with rituals designed to strip away Gas's identity as a Roman and transform him into something bestial and unworthy before he was killed. The goal was not just to execute Gas, but to make his execution into a public spectacle that would deter anyone else who might be tempted to violence against parents or family heads. On the first day after sentencing, attendants came to Gas's cell in the public prison. He had spent the night in darkness, chained to the wall, contemplating what was coming. The attendants brought with them items that would mark the beginning of his transformation from Roman citizen to condemned beast. First they removed Gas's clothing, his tunic and sandals, everything that marked him as a person of any status. They gave him instead wooden clogs to wear, cheap footwear, carved from single pieces of wood with no leather or decoration. These clogs were significant. Free Romans wore leather shoes or sandals. Slaves might wear wooden clogs if they wore footwear at all. The clogs marked Gas as something less than a citizen, less than a free person, reduced to the lowest possible status. The clogs were also deliberately uncomfortable, ill-fitting, and heavy, making walking difficult and graceless. Gas would stumble and shuffle rather than walking with the dignified bearing expected of a Roman man. Then the attendants brought the most visually striking element of the transformation. A mask made of dog skin, the hide of a dog with the fur still attached, shaped to cover Gas's face completely. The mask had eye holes, but they were small, limiting Gas's vision. The mouth hole was even smaller, restricting his breathing and making speech difficult. The mask smelled of the animal it had been made from, a constant reminder of the transformation being forced on Gas. When the attendants pulled the mask over Gas's head and tied it in place with leather cords, his human face disappeared. He looked like some hybrid creature, part human and part beast, exactly the effect intended. The symbolism was explicit. Gas had abandoned his humanity by killing his father. He had acted like an animal with violence and without the rational self-control that separated humans from beasts. Now he would be treated as an animal, marked visibly as no longer Roman, no longer human, no longer worthy of the basic dignity accorded to people. Wearing the dog skin mask and wooden clogs, Gas was taken from his cell and brought to the streets of Rome for the first of the public humiliation rituals. A herald walked before him carrying a placard and announcing his crime loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. His published parricide condemned to the Colossus for the murder of his father. The herald repeated this announcement continuously as the procession moved through densely populated areas, ensuring that as many Romans as possible would witness the condemned man and understand what he had done. The parade route had been carefully planned to maximize the number of witnesses. It wound through the suburb, a densely populated neighborhood where many common Romans lived in multi-story apartment buildings. Thousands of people came to their windows or into the streets to watch. They jeered, they shouted insults. They spat at Gaius as he passed. They threw rotten food and filth, vegetables that had spoiled the contents of chamber pots, anything degrading they could find. Children were encouraged by their parents to mock the parricide, to shout insults, to throw small stones that would not cause serious injury, but would hurt and further humiliate. The parade took hours, winding through the suburb, then to the Forum, then through other major streets and neighborhoods. By the time it ended, tens of thousands of Romans had witnessed Gaius being paraded in his dog skin mask and wooden clogs, while being pelted with filth and mockery. The mask prevented Gas from speaking in his own defense, or even seeing clearly where he was going. He stumbled repeatedly in the wooden clogs. When he fell, guards kicked him and pulled him roughly to his feet, forcing him to continue. He was not allowed to rest or remove the filth that covered him. He was an object to be displayed, not a person who might have needs or dignity. On the second day, Gaius was brought to the Forum for another public ritual. This time he was forced to drag through the Forum the actual leather sack that would be used for his execution. The sack had been brought from wherever it was stored and placed in the Forum for this specific purpose. It was made of thick, heavy leather sewn into a cylindrical shape, large enough to contain a man and the 4 animals that would accompany him. The sack weighed perhaps 30 or 40 hulbin, heavy enough that dragging it across stone pavement required significant effort. Gas, still wearing the doggin mask and wooden clogs, was told to drag the sack from one end of the Forum to the other and back. He struggled with the weight. The mask made breathing difficult, and the physical exertion quickly exhausted him. The crowd watched and laughed. This preview of his execution method allowed Romans to contemplate exactly what would happen to Gas, to imagine him stuffed into that sack with the animals, to visualize his drowning in the tide. The physical struggle with the sack reinforced that Gas was weak, unable to perform even this simple task with dignity, confirming that he deserved the fate awaiting him. After dragging the sack through the Forum, Gas was forced to perform another ritual that completed his separation from Roman society. He was made to prostrate himself before a statue of his murdered father that had been brought from the family home and set up temporarily in the Forum. The statue was a small bronze portrait bust that normally resided in the family's household shrine where ancestors were honored. Now it served as a focal point for the ritual of dissociation. Gas had to lie face down in the dirt before the statue, while priests performed a formal ceremony. These were priests who specialized in rituals related to family and ancestors, religious specialists who understood the sacred nature of the pattern's authority. The head priest pronounced words that had been established by tradition for this specific purpose. This man is no longer Roman. This man is no longer a son. This man has no family, no name, no place among the living. He is anathema, cursed outside the bonds of human community. We cast him out from the fellowship of ancestors and descendants. We deny him memory and honor. We erase him from the records of his family as if he had never been born. This ritual dissociation was deeply significant in Roman religious and social thinking. Romans believed that criminals who violated fundamental social norms needed to be formally expelled from society before execution. Simply killing them was not enough. They had to be declared non-persons, stripped of identity and relationship, made into nothing before being destroyed. This reflected the Roman concern with proper categorization and social order. Everything and everyone had a designated place in Roman society. The social structure depended on everyone knowing their place and fulfilling the duties appropriate to that place. Parricides had violated their place so completely that they had to be recategorized as non-human before punishment could proceed. The criminal had to be dehumanized, expelled from society, and destroyed in a way that left no trace. Now, let me tell you about another category of humiliation, one that combined entertainment with punishment, and that created some of the most disturbing spectacles in Roman history. These were the theatrical executions and forced performances in the arena, what the Romans called damnatio ad ludos, condemnation to the games. This category of punishment reveals how Romans could transform death itself into entertainment, how they could use mythology and theater to add layers of mockery and degradation to executions. Most people know that Romans executed criminals in the arena, feeding them to wild animals or forcing them to fight as gladiators. But what is less well known is that many arena executions involved elaborate theatrical elements designed to humiliate the condemned before killing them. Criminals were forced to play roles in mythological reenactments, often roles that were degrading or that involved intimate violation before being killed as the climax of the performance. Let me tell you about Lucius Corvinus, a composite character based on sources describing theatrical executions during the reigns of Emperors Nero and Domitian. Lucius was a minor official, an assistant to a magistrate responsible for tax collection who was convicted of embezzlement. The amounts involved were substantial. Lucius had diverted tax revenues to his own accounts over a period of several years. When the theft was discovered and investigated, Lucius was convicted and sentenced not to simple execution, but to execution in the arena during the next set of public games. Lucius was informed that he would participate in a mythological performance. He would play the role of Orpheus, the legendary musician who descended to the underworld to rescue his deceased wife, Eurydice. The story of Orpheus was well known to educated Romans. He had played his lyre so beautifully that even wild animals and trees and rocks had been moved by his music. When his wife died, Orpheus had descended to the underworld and convinced the gods of death to allow her to return to life. But Orpheus had violated the condition of her release by looking back at her before they reached the surface, and Eurydice had been pulled back into death. This sounds almost dignified, playing the role of a legendary hero and musician. Lucius was given a tunic to wear and a lyre, a stringed instrument that he had no idea how to play. He was led into the arena where elaborate sets had been constructed to represent a forest. Painted backdrops showed trees and rocks. Props created the illusion of a mythological landscape. The crowd watched from the stands, tens of thousands of Romans enjoying the spectacle. Lucius was told to play the lyre and sing, attracting animals through the power of his music, just as Orpheus had done in myth. He stood in the center of the arena holding the lyre awkwardly, having no musical training or skill. He plucked at the strings, producing discordant sounds. He tried to sing, but his voice was shaking with fear and came out as a weak, off-key warble. The crowd laughed at his incompetent performance. This was part of the entertainment, watching a condemned criminal try desperately to perform a role he was completely unable to fulfill. But the animals released into the arena were not tamed or trained. They were bears and lions, large predators that had been starved for days to make them aggressive and willing to attack humans. When the gates opened and the animals entered the arena, they did not react to Lucius's music by becoming calm or attracted. They identified him as prey. The bears lumbered toward him. The lions circled, their eyes fixed on his movement. Lucius realized what was happening. He tried to run, dropping the lyre, abandoning the pretense of the performance. But there was nowhere to run. The arena was enclosed. Guards prevented him from escaping through the gates. The animals were faster than he was. The crowd cheered as the bears and lions closed in on Lucius. They cheered louder when the first bear reached him and struck him with a massive paw, knocking him to the ground. They roared with approval when the lions joined the attack, tearing at Lucius while he screamed and tried futilely to defend himself. The performance ended with Lucius being killed and partially consumed by the animals, while the crowd watched and enjoyed the spectacle. His death had been transformed into entertainment, and his final moments had been spent in the humiliating charade of believing that music might save him, that playing a role he could not possibly perform well might somehow prevent the fate that had been determined from the moment he entered the arena. Other theatrical executions were even more explicitly designed to humiliate and degrade. Criminals convicted of offenses related to intimacy or morality were sometimes forced to reenact myths that involved degradation or violation. Historical sources mention performances where condemned individuals were forced into situations designed to mock and destroy any remaining dignity before death. One example documented in sources involves a man who was forced to reenact the myth of Passé, the mythological queen who had relations with a bull. The condemned man was positioned in a wooden framework shaped roughly like a cow or bull, designed to facilitate interaction with an actual bull that was brought into the arena. The crowd watched this degrading spectacle which combined intimate violation with public mockery. After this humiliation, wild animals were released to kill the condemned man. The execution was framed as justice, as appropriate punishment for someone who had violated moral standards, but it was also entertainment that the crowd clearly enjoyed. These theatrical executions served multiple purposes beyond simply killing criminals. They provided entertainment that was more elaborate and memorable than straightforward execution. They allowed Romans to watch mythological stories enacted with real consequences, bringing ancient legends to life in visceral way. They humiliated criminals in ways that seemed to match their perceived crimes with those who had committed intimate offenses experiencing intimate degradation before death. And they reinforced the idea that criminals were less than human, fit only to be used for public amusement before being disposed of. Women condemned to the arena faced particularly gendered forms of humiliation. Sources mention women being forced to fight as gladiators while stripped of clothing or nearly naked, their bodies displayed for the entertainment and judgment of tens of thousands of spectators. Women convicted of adultery or of working in brothel were sometimes subjected to what sources euphemistically call exposure, being placed in situations where they faced violation by animals or by other condemned criminals before being executed. These punishments specifically targeted female prudetia, the modesty and virtue that defined respectable womanhood in Roman society. Destroying a woman's intimate honor before killing her was considered appropriate punishment for crimes involving moral or intimate transgression. The arena also hosted punishments for slaves who had rebelled against their masters. After the suppression of Spartacus's revolt in 71 before the Common Era, 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Aegean Way, the main road from Rome to Capua. The crucifixions stretched for over 100 miles with bodies visible from the road every 100 feet. They were forced to fight each other to the death while dressed in ridiculous costumes that mocked their rebellion. They were made to reenact their own revolt as farce, with the leaders dressed as fake kings wearing cheap crowns and holding wooden scepters, and the followers as mock soldiers carrying toy weapons. All of it performed for Roman entertainment before they were killed. These spectacles of humiliation and death were scheduled during major festivals and religious holidays. They were not hidden or conducted in private. They were central features of Roman public life, attended by massive crowds, including children, women of all social classes, and elite families sitting in the best seats. The normalization of these brutal entertainments reveals something important about Roman values and psychology. Romans did not view criminals, slaves, or defeated enemies as deserving the kind of human dignity that citizens deserved. They viewed them as resources to be exploited for the benefit and amusement of the citizen body. The suffering of the condemned was not regrettable or something to be avoided. It was entertaining, satisfying to watch, appropriate demonstration of Roman power and justice. The more elaborate and memorable the suffering, the more effective the entertainment and the deterrent effect. This ability to watch others suffer and die while eating snacks and socializing with friends. To treat horrible death as casual entertainment is difficult for modern people to fully comprehend, but it was completely normalized in Roman society. Children grew up attending the games and learning to enjoy them. Elite women discussed arena performances as social events, commenting on which gladiators fought well or which executions were particularly memorable. Emperors gained popularity by sponsoring elaborate games with creative executions. The arena was woven into the fabric of Roman social life in ways that made the cruelty seem normal, even necessary for maintaining social bonds and proper value. Now, let me tell you about one of the most taboo and rarely discussed forms of Roman humiliation. What some sources hint at with the term subitio and what is more broadly understood as ritualized bodily violation as punishment. This is difficult to discuss because the sources are often vague, using euphemisms or indirect language to describe practices that Romans themselves found disturbing to discuss explicitly. But enough evidence exists to reconstruct that bodily and intimate violation was sometimes used as punishment, particularly for men convicted of treason, cowardice in battle, or other crimes that suggested failed masculinity. Roman masculinity, as I explained earlier, was built on the concept of physical inviolability. A proper Roman man was never the passive recipient of another's actions in ways that suggested domination or submission. He was always the actor, the one who imposed will rather than having will imposed upon him. This inviolability extended to his body. Elite Roman men expected their bodies to be physically inviolate, not touched without permission, not subjected to treatment that suggested subordination or violation. This meant that threatening or actually inflicting dirty violation on a condemned man, particularly intimate violation that feminized him or reduced him to the status of a slave or woman, was understood as one of the most devastating humiliations possible. It destroyed masculine honor more completely than beating or even execution could, because it attacked the core of what made someone a proper Roman man. Let me tell you about Sextus Aurelius, a composite character based on fragments in sources discussing punishments for military cowardice and for certain categories of treason. Sextus was a centurion, a mid-level military officer commanding approximately 80 men in a Roman legion. During a battle on the German frontier, Sextus's unit was ordered to hold a position against a much larger force of Germanic warriors. The position was strategically important. If it fell, the entire Roman line might collapse. But Sextus panicked. As the Germanic warriors charged, as he saw the size of the force attacking his position, Sextus made a decision that would destroy him. He ordered his men to retreat. He abandoned the position, fleeing from battle and taking his unit with him. His cowardice had immediate consequences. The Germanic warriors broke through where Sextus should have held. Other Roman units were flanked and suffered heavy casualties. The battle was eventually won by Roman reinforcements, but Sextus's cowardice had cost Roman lives, and had nearly cost the entire engagement. Sextus was captured by Roman military police and brought before a military tribunal. His men testified against him. Officers described the consequences of his cowardice. Sextus tried to defend himself, arguing that he had made a tactical decision, that the position was untenable, that retreating saved his men from pointless death. The tribunal was not persuaded. Sextus had not been ordered to retreat. He had not attempted to send word requesting permission to withdraw. He had simply run, abandoning his post because he was afraid. That was cowardice, the worst crime a Roman soldier could commit. The tribunal convicted Sextus and prescribed a punishment designed to match his crime. Sextus had failed as a Roman man in the most fundamental way, showing cowardice in battle, abandoning his masculine duty to face danger without flinching. His punishment would strip away his masculine honor, would feminize him. would reduce him to something less than a proper man before killing him. Sextus was brought before his legion, which had been assembled to witness the punishment. This public nature was essential. The punishment was not just about Sextus. It was about teaching every soldier in the legion what happened to cowards. What happened to men who failed to uphold masculine virtues of courage and honor. Sextus stood before thousands of his former comrades, while his crimes were read aloud. Then the systematic destruction of his identity as a Roman soldier and man began. Attendants approached Sextus and removed his military decorations. He had earned several during his years of service before his final act of cowardice. A torque for valor, a medallion for long service, arm rings marking his rank. All were stripped away, taken from him while the legion watched. Then his armor was removed piece by piece, each element representing his status as a Roman soldier. His helmet, his breastplate, his greaves, his military belt, the symbol of his rank as centurion, his sword, the tool of his trade and the mark of his authority. Finally, his military tunic was removed, leaving him standing in only a basic undergarment. But he would not be left even with that minimal covering. The attendants had brought a woman's stola, a long dress that Roman women wore. Sextus was forced to put on this feminine garment. His face was painted with cosmetics, rouge on his cheeks and lips, making him appear more feminine. His hair, which he wore in the short military style, was bound up with ribbons in a way that mimicked women's hairstyles. This gender inversion was profoundly humiliating. Sextus was being visually and symbolically transformed from soldier to woman, from masculine to feminine, from honorable to shameful. The soldiers watching jeered and mocked him. They called him by feminine names. They referred to him as wife and woman and other terms that suggested he was no longer a man. The mockery was not random. It was calculated to destroy any remaining sense of masculine identity. Sextus might cling to. Then, according to sources that describe similar punishments, though using careful and euphemistic language, Sextus was subjected to ritualized bodily violation. The exact nature of this is difficult to determine from sources that avoid explicit description. Some accounts suggest symbolic violation with objects like wooden rods or implements, actions designed to suggest feminine receptivity and submission. Other accounts hint more strongly at actual physical violation by multiple men, acts that would utterly destroy any claim to masculine honor or status. The purpose of this violation, whether symbolic or actual, was not gratification for those performing it. The purpose was complete humiliation of the victim. The acts proved that Sextus was not a proper Roman man, that he could be dominated and treated like a woman or a slave, that his cowardice in battle reflected fundamental weakness that extended to every aspect of his being, including his body, and his ability to defend his own physical integrity. After this humiliation, which was performed publicly before the assembled legion, Sextus was executed. The method varied depending on the specific case and the commanding officer's preferences. Sometimes cowards were beaten to death by their fellow soldiers, each man in the legion striking blows. Sometimes they were crucified. Sometimes they were beheaded. But the execution was almost secondary to the violation and humiliation that preceded it. The destruction of Sextus's masculine honor was the real punishment. Death simply ended a life that had already been made worthless through feminization and violation. These ritualized bodily punishments targeting masculinity were probably not common in frequency, but they existed as possibilities that enforced masculine codes of behavior through fear. Roman soldiers knew that cowardice or failure might result not just in execution but in humiliations that would destroy their honor completely. The threat of being feminized, of being violated, of being reduced to the status of women or slaves was powerfully motivating. It encouraged the aggressive, dominating masculinity that Roman military culture valued and that was considered essential for maintaining the empire through constant warfare. The use of bodily humiliation as punishment extended beyond military context. Sources mentioned that some criminals convicted of what Romans called effeminacy, men who took passive roles in intimate relationships with other men, were subjected to punishments that involved public humiliation related to their intimate behavior before execution. Men who had violated gender norms by acting in ways considered feminine were forced to perform those acts publicly before being executed. This served to reinforce hierarchies related to gender and intimacy, demonstrating that passive or feminine roles for men were not just personally shameful, but worthy of state punishment. Women convicted of adultery faced different but equally gendered forms of humiliation related to intimacy and the body. In addition to possible exposure to animals or criminals in the arena, as I described earlier, adulteresses might be subjected to public display in brothel, forced to work in those establishments as punishment before execution. This destroyed their pudicia completely, transforming them from respectable matrons into the most despised category of Roman women, those who sold intimate access to any buyer. The punishment matched the perceived crime. Adultery involved illicit intimate behavior, so the punishment involved forcing the woman into a role defined by such behavior, reducing her to the status of someone whose body was publicly available. The targeting of intimacy and the body as sites of punishment reveals how deeply Roman honor was tied to gendered expectations and hierarchies. To be a proper Roman man meant occupying a dominant, inviolable position. To be a proper Roman woman meant maintaining modesty and intimate virtue. Anyone who violated these expectations could be punished not just with violence, but with humiliations that forcibly reposition them in the hierarchy, in degrading ways, stripping away the gender identity they had claimed, and replacing it with markers of shame. Let me tell you now about a category of punishment that targeted slaves who rebelled or who challenged their masters in ways that threatened the fundamental hierarchy of Roman society. This was called the servile ladder ritual, a punishment that combined physical torture with systematic symbolic humiliation designed to break the slave spirit and demonstrate to other slaves what happened to those who resisted the natural order. Imagine Davis, a composite character based on documented cases of slave punishments described in legal texts and historical chronicles. Davis was a household slave, born into slavery, who had served the same family his entire life. He worked in the kitchen and dining areas of an elite household in Rome. He was considered reliable and skilled. But during a dinner party, Davis's master, a senator named Gas Clodius, falsely accused Davis of stealing wine. The accusation was based on nothing more than the fact that some wine was missing, and Davis had been responsible for serving it. Davis insisted he had not stolen anything, that perhaps guests had consumed more than expected, or that the accounting was incorrect. Claudius, drunk and angry, struck Davis across the face. Davis, humiliated before the dinner guests and furious at being falsely accused and physically attacked, made a terrible mistake. He struck back, not hard, just a reflexive push, trying to create distance between himself and his master, but it was enough. Davis had raised his hand against his master. That was one of the most serious crimes a slave could commit. Claudius had Davis arrested immediately and brought before a magistrate. The charge was assault on a citizen, specifically on a senator. The evidence was incontrovertible. Multiple dinner guests had witnessed the incident. Davis had no defense. He tried to explain about the false accusation, about being struck first, about acting reflexively rather than deliberately. None of it mattered. A slave who struck his master regardless of provocation was guilty of a crime that demanded severe punishment. The penalty was death, but the execution would be preceded by a public humiliation ritual, designed to reassert the proper hierarchy between master and slave. On the appointed day, Davis was taken from the prison to the forum, where a tall wooden ladder had been erected specifically for this punishment. The ladder extended perhaps 20 feet into the air, steep and difficult to climb. At various rungs of the ladder stood magistrates and prominent citizens, perhaps 10 or 12 men positioned at intervals from bottom to top. These were men of status and authority representing Roman social hierarchy, made visible. Davis was brought to the base of the ladder. He had been stripped completely naked, his body exposed to the thousands of Romans who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Nudity for slaves was less shameful than for citizens, but public nudity during punishment was still degrading, marking the slave as utterly without dignity or status. His hands were bound in front of him, though loosely enough that he could use them to grip the ladder rungs. His feet were left free because he would need them to climb. Guards pushed Davis toward the ladder and ordered him to begin climbing, but there was a requirement. At each rung where a man stood, Davis had to stop and kiss that man's feet. This was the central humiliating element of the punishment. The physical act of kissing feet was deeply degrading in Roman culture. Romans expected inferiors to show deference, but foot kissing was considered appropriate only in situations of extreme supplication or when honoring someone of vastly superior status, like an emperor. Forcing Davis to kiss the feet of multiple men as he climbed reinforced the hierarchy. He was abject prostrate, showing submission to his social superiors in the most debasing way possible. Davis began climbing. His bound hands made gripping the rungs difficult. His naked body was exposed to the gaze of thousands. When he reached the first rung where a man stood, Davis had to position himself awkwardly to kiss the man's feet. The man was wearing sandals, and Davis had to press his lips to the leather, to the visible dust and dirt on the footwear. The man looked down at him with contempt. The crowd jeered. Some spit in Davis's direction. Others shouted insults. "Slave, animal, thing." Davis continued climbing to the next occupied rung. Again, he had to stop and kiss feet, this time of a different magistrate, who shifted his foot deliberately to make the act more difficult and degrading. The crowd's jeering increased. Each kiss was greeted with laughter and mockery. Children in the crowd were encouraged by their parents to join in the mockery to learn early that this was appropriate treatment for slaves who challenged the social order. As Davis climbed higher, the ladder became steeper and more precarious. The angle increased near the top, making it more like climbing a wall than a ladder. His bound hands struggled to maintain grip. Several times he slipped, nearly falling, catching himself at the last moment. The crowd laughed at his struggles. His physical vulnerability and weakness was being demonstrated visibly. He was not strong. He was not capable. He was a slave who had foolishly challenged someone stronger. And now his weakness was being exposed before thousands of witnesses. When Davis finally reached the top rung, having kissed the feet of a dozen men during his ascent, a final figure waited. This was a man with a whip, specifically positioned to administer the next phase of punishment. Without warning or ceremony, the man began lashing Davis across his back and shoulders with a heavy whip. Davis, already exhausted from the climb and from the emotional toll of the foot kissing, could barely maintain his grip on the ladder. Each strike knocked him off balance. He tried to hold on, but the blows were too forceful and too frequent. After perhaps a dozen lashes, Davis lost his grip and fell. He tumbled down the ladder, his body striking multiple rungs on the way down before hitting the forum floor hard. The fall was from about 20 feet, high enough to cause serious injury. Davis landed badly, something in his leg breaking with an audible crack. He lay in the dirt, gasping and writhing in pain, while the crowd roared with approval and satisfaction. The fall symbolized Davis's descent from his moment of defiance, his moment of daring to strike his master, back to his proper place in the dirt where slaves belonged, broken, bleeding, and defeated. But the punishment was not finished. Guards pulled Davis to his feet, or tried to. He could not stand on his broken leg. They dragged him through the dirt to where his master, Gas Claudius, stood watching. Davis was forced to crawl to his master and beg forgiveness. He had to prostrate himself completely, pressing his face to the ground, and beg to be allowed to continue serving. The words he had to speak had been prescribed. "Master, I am nothing. I am less than nothing. I am a worm, unworthy to lick the dirt from your feet. I beg your mercy. I beg to be allowed to serve you again, even though I am unworthy. Please, Master, do not cast me out. Let me prove my devotion through continued service." The begging was painful to listen to, a complete psychological destruction of whatever pride or dignity Davis might have still possessed. Claudius listened to the begging for several minutes, letting Davis grovel and plead, letting the crowd witness the complete subjugation of the rebellious slave. Then Claudius pronounced his judgment. "You are forgiven for your crime of striking me, but you must still be punished for the violence you committed. You will be executed by crucifixion as final demonstration of what happens to slaves who raise their hands against citizens." The servile ladder ritual was not used for all slave punishments, only for slaves whose crimes involved challenging authority in ways that threatened the master-slave hierarchy that undergird all of Roman society. The elaborate public nature of the punishment served multiple purposes simultaneously. It deterred other slaves from similar resistance by showing exactly what would happen to them. It reasserted the absolute authority of masters over slaves, demonstrating visually that slaves who challenged that authority would be broken and forced to submit. It provided entertainment for citizens who enjoyed watching slaves humiliated and suffer. And it reinforced the ideological belief that the social hierarchy was natural and necessary, that slaves who tried to rise above their station were acting against nature itself and deserved to be crushed back into their proper place. Crucifixion itself, the execution method prescribed for Davis and for rebellious slaves generally, was designed to be maximally humiliating as well as painful. The condemned was stripped naked and displayed publicly for hours or days while dying slowly. The public nudity and helpless exposure was as much part of the punishment as the physical suffering. Passers-by would mock and spit on the crucified. Family members might be forced to walk. The body would not be taken down for proper burial, but would be left to rot or be consumed by scavengers as final denial of human dignity. After Spartacus's revolt was suppressed in 71 before the Common Era, 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Ion Way from Rome to Capua. The bodies remained on crosses for months as a warning to other slaves throughout Italy. Travelers on the road would pass mile after mile of crucified bodies at various stages of decomposition. The smell would have been overwhelming. The visual impact would have been impossible to forget. The message was clear and brutal. This is what happens to slaves who rebel. This is the fate awaiting anyone who challenges Roman authority. This is what Rome does to those who forget their place. And the message was effective. For decades after Spartacus, slave revolts in Italy were rare. Despite the massive enslaved population that worked the farms and mines and households of the Roman world, the memory of those 6,000 bodies lined along Rome's most important road served as a powerful deterrent. Slaves understood that rebellion would not lead to freedom, but to horrible public death. The crucifixions were not just punishment for the individuals who had participated in Spartacus's revolt. They were a message to all slaves everywhere about the absolute nature of Roman power and the futility of resistance. Now, let me tell you about gendered humiliations specifically designed for elite women. Punishments that destroyed female honor and status in ways that paralleled, but differed from the humiliations inflicted on men. These punishments often involved mock religious ceremonies that parodied the sacred roles elite women could occupy in Roman religion and society, turning honor into shame through ritualized mockery. Elite Roman women could serve as priestesses in various religious cults. The Vests, priestesses of Vesta, who maintained the sacred fire in her temple, were among the most honored women in Rome. They took vows of chastity and devoted their lives to religious service. Their persons were considered sacred. Harming a Vestal was a serious crime. But if a Vestal violated her vow of chastity, the punishment was death by being buried alive. A horrible fate that also involved ritualized humiliation before execution. Other women served as priestesses of Ceres, of Juno, of various goddesses. These religious roles gave women public visibility and respect that they could not achieve in other ways. They were performing sacred duties that helped maintain Rome's relationship with the gods. Their religious service was valuable and honored. Women who violated their religious duties or who committed crimes that involved betraying female honor faced punishments that parodied their sacred roles. Let me tell you about Claudia Teresia, a composite character based on documented cases of elite women punished for adultery or sacrilege. Claudia was the wife of a wealthy equestrian. She came from a respectable family. She had been raised with all the advantages of elite status, but she committed adultery with a younger man, a friend of her husband's. The affair was discovered. Her husband brought charges against her in a public trial. The trial itself was humiliating, with intimate details of the affair discussed publicly before judges and witnesses. Claudia tried to defend herself, arguing that her husband had neglected her, that he had his own affairs, that her behavior was no worse than what many Roman men did without facing punishment. The judges were not sympathetic. The sexual double standard in Roman law was explicit. Men could have affairs with slaves or prostitutes or unmarried women with minimal social consequences. Women who committed adultery violated fundamental social norms and deserved severe punishment. Claudia was convicted. The punishment prescribed was not simple execution, but a ritual humiliation that would destroy her honor completely before death. She was to undergo what sources call a celestium of shame, a parody of the celestium, a sacred banquet where priestesses honored goddesses by preparing elaborate ritual meals. On the appointed day, Claudia was dressed in the robes of a priestess and brought to a temple. But instead of performing proper rituals, she was forced to perform them incorrectly, deliberately making mistakes in the sacred formulas and procedures. She had to recite prayers with wrong words. She had to make offerings in wrong order. She had to perform ritual gestures backwards or incompletely. Each mistake was greeted with laughter and jeering from the assembled crowd who had come to watch the spectacle. The mockery served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that Claudia was not a proper woman, that her adultery had disqualified her from participating in sacred rites that required purity. It showed that she was unworthy of the religious roles that gave elite women honor and respect, and it provided entertainment, turning religious ritual into farce, making the sacred profane through deliberate error and mockery. After the mock religious ceremony, Claudia was forced to undergo another humiliation designed to invert her social status. She was taken to a mock banquet where she had to serve slaves. This was a complete reversal of normal social order. Elite women did not serve anyone except in ritual contexts where service to gods was honorable. To serve slaves, the lowest members of Roman society, was profoundly degrading. Claudia had to bring food and wine to slaves who had been assembled for this specific purpose. The slaves were encouraged to mock her, to make crude remarks, to treat her with contempt. Some made explicitly crude comments about her body or about the adultery she had committed. She had to endure this mockery while continuing to serve, unable to defend herself or lead. The ritual demonstrated that Claudia had lost her place in the social order completely. She was now lower than slaves, reduced to serving even those who occupied the bottom of Roman society. The celestium of shame could be extended to include even more degrading elements. Some sources hint darkly at forced pairings with slaves or animals as part of the spectacle, ritualized destructions of the woman's marital status and virtue. The exact nature of these forced pairings is unclear from sources that use euphemistic language, but the basic idea was to demonstrate that the woman was no longer fit for honorable marriage, that her adultery had reduced her to a status where only shameful partnerships were appropriate. After these humiliations, Claudia would typically be executed. The method varied, but for adulteresses it often involved being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a cliff on the Capitoline Hill used for executing certain categories of criminals. The execution was almost secondary to the destruction of honor that preceded it. Claudia had been systematically stripped of every marker of elite female status. Her religious purity had been mocked. Her social position had been inverted. Her marital virtue had been destroyed through forced degradation. Death simply ended a life that had been made socially worthless through systematic humiliation. These gendered punishments for women reveal how female honor worked differently than male honor in Roman society. Male honor was about dominance, inviolability, and the ability to act upon others rather than being acted upon. Female honor was about purity, propriety, and maintaining the virtue that made women suitable wives and mothers for legitimate Roman families. Punishments for men often involve feminization, violation, and reduction to passive status. Punishments for women involve destruction of purity, mockery of religious roles, and forced service or degradation that demonstrated loss of virtue. Both types of punishment destroyed honor, but they did so in ways that reflected and reinforced gender-specific ideals about what made someone a proper Roman man or woman. Now let me tell you about one of the strangest categories of Roman humiliation: punishments that continued even after death. Romans believed that honor and memory could be destroyed posthumously through rituals that attacked a person's reputation and legacy, even after they could no longer defend themselves. These post-mortem humiliations included damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, and various rituals that symbolically executed or degraded a person after they had physically died. Damnatio memoriae was an official decree passed by the Senate that ordered a person's name to be erased from public records, their statues destroyed, their images defaced, and their memory condemned. This was typically used against emperors or other powerful figures who had fallen from favor after death. The goal was complete erasure, to pretend a person had never existed, to deny them the immortality that Romans sought through their reputations and memorial. But damnatio memorial could be accompanied by more active rituals of humiliation that went beyond simple erasure. Let me tell you about what happened to the memory of Emperor Domitian after his assassination in 96 of the Common Era. Domitian had been an unpopular emperor, particularly with the Senate, which he had treated with suspicion and contempt throughout his reign. He had executed or exiled numerous senators on charges of treason or conspiracy. The Senate hated him but had been forced to show deference while he lived. After Domitian's assassination, the Senate finally had its revenge. They decreed damnatio memoria, ordering his name erased from all public inscriptions, his statues destroyed throughout the empire, his coins defaced, but they went further. They organized a mock funeral, a public ritual that symbolically executed Domitian's reputation and memory. An effigy of Domitian was created, a life-sized representation of the dead emperor. This effigy was paraded through the streets of Rome, but not in the honorable upright position used for normal funeral processions. Instead, the effigy was carried upside down, a position associated with the underworld, with criminals, with dishonor. The inverted position suggested that Domitian was not ascending to the gods as a proper emperor should, but descending to punishment in the underworld. The procession wound through Rome, gathering crowds who came to witness the spectacle. Citizens were encouraged to curse the mission's memory, to spit on the effigy, to shout insults at the representation of the dead emperor. Many did so enthusiastically, expressing publicly the contempt they had been forced to hide while Domitian lived. The collective cursing and mockery served to destroy Domitian's reputation completely, to ensure that he would be remembered not as a legitimate emperor, but as a tyrant who had been rejected by the Roman people. The effigy was taken to the Forum, where it was publicly burned in a ceremony that parodied proper funeral rites. Instead of being cremated with honor and respect, the effigy was thrown onto a bonfire while the crowd cheered. Citizens threw trash and filth onto the burning effigy. The fire was accompanied not by solemn prayers and remembrance, but by jeering and celebration. The message was clear: Domitian's death was not a loss to be mourned, but a liberation to be celebrated. Meanwhile, throughout Rome, Domitian's statues were being systematically destroyed. Angry crowds toppled bronze and marble statues of the emperor. They smashed the faces, chiseled away the inscriptions, defaced the images beyond recognition. In some cases, the heads were cut off statues and rolled through the streets like balls while crowds kicked them and spat on them. The destruction of Domitian's images was not just about removing them from public spaces. It was about actively destroying representations of him, about expressing collective hatred through violence against his stone and metal likeness. Domitian's name was chiseled off public buildings and monuments throughout the empire. Anywhere his name appeared in stone, workers were sent to remove it. In many cases, you can still see today on Roman monuments the rectangular spaces where Domitian's name was chiseled away. Gaps in inscriptions that marked where his name used to be. These gaps became permanent testimony to his damnation, visible reminders for future generations that this emperor had been so hated that even his name had to be erased. Domitian's family was forbidden from maintaining his memory properly. They could not perform the usual rituals honoring a deceased family member. They could not maintain his tomb as a place of respect and remembrance. They could not commission artworks celebrating his life. Domitian was to be forgotten as completely as possible, erased from collective memory and from family histories. These posthumous punishments were significant because Romans believed that a form of immortality came through memory and reputation. A Roman who was remembered honorably after death lived on in the collective memory of Roman society. His name would be spoken. His deeds would be recounted. His tomb would be visited. His family would honor him. This continued existence in memory was what Romans sought through their public service and their careful cultivation of reputation during life. A Roman who was forgotten ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Without memory, without honor, without family maintaining his name, he was truly dead. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered to Roman sensibility. Damnatio memorial was therefore a form of eternal punishment, condemning a person not just in life or in death, but in perpetuity, ensuring they would not achieve the immortality through memory that all Romans sought. Some post-mortem humiliations were even more extreme and physical. Sources mention cases where the actual bodies of condemned criminals or enemies were exhumed after burial and subjected to ritual mutilation. The corpses were dragged through the streets, exposed to public mockery, dismembered and scattered. The heads might be displayed on spikes as trophies. The remains would be denied proper burial, left to rot in public spaces or thrown into rivers or sewers. This denial of burial was considered extremely serious. Romans believed that the unburied dead could not rest peacefully, that their spirits would wander restlessly for eternity. Proper burial rites were essential for allowing the deceased to transition to the afterlife. Denying burial was condemning the person to eternal suffering and unrest, a fate that continued beyond physical death into whatever afterlife Romans believed awaited them. Families of those subjected to posthumous humiliation faced their own forms of punishment. They might be forbidden from mourning publicly, from wearing mourning clothes or expressing grief in ways that would honor the deceased's memory. They might be forced to participate in the rituals condemning their deceased relative, pressured to join in the destruction of statues or the defacement of monuments. They might face social ostracism or even property confiscation, punishment that extended from the individual to everyone connected to them by blood or marriage. The use of posthumous humiliation reveals how central reputation and memory were to Roman identity and values. A person's social existence did not end with physical death. Their memory continued to exist in the minds of others, in physical monuments and inscriptions, in the stories people told about them. Romans understood that attacking memory could be as effective as attacking the living person. Perhaps more effective because the dead could not defend themselves, could not fight back, could not resist the destruction of their reputations. There is one final category of humiliation I need to discuss, one that sounds almost absurd, but that reveals the Roman talent for combining cruelty with mockery in ways that made punishment both entertaining and effective. These were the animal humiliations, punishments that used animals to symbolize and amplify the degradation of the condemned person. The most well-known of these was the mule parade used for minor offenders, particularly corrupt officials or chronic debtors who had not paid their obligations. The condemned was stripped naked or dressed in ridiculous clothing that exaggerated their offense. They were painted with substances that made them visually striking and absurd. Chalk or white paint to make their skin ghostly pale, soot or charcoal to make them completely black, sometimes bright colors like red or yellow. The painting marked them as something other than normal, as ridiculous and worthy of mockery. Then they were placed backwards on a mule. The proper way to ride any mount was facing forward, sitting upright with dignity. Forcing someone to ride backwards suggested they were moving in the wrong direction, that they were improper and shameful, that they had reversed the natural order. The mule itself was significant. Mules were working animals, hybrids of horses and donkeys. considered lower status than horses. Elite Romans rode horses when they needed mounted transport. Poor Romans and slaves used mules for heavy work, forcing a condemned person, especially a formerly elite person, to ride a mule was a status degradation, associating them with the lowest classes and with farm work. The backwards mule ride through public spaces maximized humiliation and mockery. The condemned person could not control where they were going. They faced backwards, unable to see where the mule was being led. They were positioned in a ridiculous and undignified posture. They were vulnerable to whatever the crowd wanted to throw at them or shout at them. The entire spectacle was designed to transform the condemned into a living joke, someone so absurd that they could never be taken seriously again. But the mule parade could be enhanced with additional degrading elements that made it even more memorable and effective. Some condemned people were forced to bray like donkeys during the parade, making animal sounds that associated them with stupidity and stubbornness. Donkeys and mules were stereotyped in Roman culture as stupid animals, difficult and obstinate. Making the condemned person bray reinforced that they were not just riding an animal, but becoming like the animal, taking on its characteristics. Others were required to carry bags of dung or refuse, symbols of worthlessness and contamination. The condemned would ride backwards on the mule while clutching bags that everyone knew contained waste, marked visibly as someone who dealt in filth and garbage. Sometimes the bags would break or spill, covering the condemned in waste, adding physical degradation to the visual mockery. The crowd would pelt the condemned with rotten food and filth as they passed. Spoiled vegetables, overripe fruit that splattered on impact, the contents of chamber pots. Children would run alongside the mule, mocking the rider and competing to see who could throw the most disgusting things with the most accurate aim. Parents would encourage this behavior, teaching children that mocking condemned criminals was appropriate and entertaining. Let me tell you about Titus Grass, not the famous tribune of the same name, but a composite character based on sources describing debt punishment and minor official corruption. Titus was a minor official, an assistant to magistrates responsible for tax collection, who had embezzled relatively small amounts of public funds to pay gambling debts. His theft was discovered during a routine. The amounts were not enormous, nothing like the corruption of someone like Marcus Livius, who faced Facon, but the theft was clear and undeniable. Titus was convicted and sentenced to the mule parade as punishment appropriate to his minor but real crime. On the appointed day, Titus was taken from prison and brought to a public square where the punishment would begin. Attendants stripped him completely naked, removing every article of clothing. His naked body was painted with chalk, making his skin ghostly white and marking him as something unnatural and worthy of mockery. Around his neck they hung a wooden sign listing his crimes in large painted letters. I stole from the people who trusted me to count their coins fairly. Then Titus was lifted onto a mule that had been brought for this specific purpose, but instead of being allowed to sit facing forward with any semblance of dignity, he was turned around and positioned backwards facing the mule's rump. His legs dangled awkwardly. He had to grip the mule's hunches to avoid falling off. The position was uncomfortable and ridiculous, exactly as intended. The mule was led by an attendant who held a rope attached to its bridle. The route had been planned to wind through densely populated areas, ensuring maximum witnesses to Titus's humiliation. As the procession began, a herald walked ahead, announcing Titus's crimes. Behold, Titus Grass, thief and betrayer of public trust. He stole money meant for the temples and the people. Now he rides in shame for all to see. The crowd's response was immediate and enthusiastic. People lined the streets, leaning out of windows, gathering in doorways. They laughed at Titus's ridiculous appearance. The naked man painted white riding backwards on a mule. They shouted insults. Thief, cheat, fool. Children ran into the streets with rotten food and garbage, throwing it at Titus as he passed. An overripe tomato hit him in the face, juice and seeds splattering across his chalk-painted skin. A piece of spoiled fish struck his chest. The contents of a chamber pot arced through the air and splashed across his back. Titus tried to maintain some dignity, tried to keep his expression neutral and his body still, but dignity was impossible in this situation. The mule's movement jostled him constantly. The position made his body look awkward and weak. The filth covering him smelled terrible and attracted flies, and worst of all, he was required at regular intervals to pray like a donkey, making the harsh braying sound that mules and donkeys produced. An attendant walking beside the mule would prompt him, "Pray for us, thief. Show us what you've become." Titus would be forced to open his mouth and produce the animal sound. A loud, harsh, ridiculous noise that made the crowd laugh even harder. Each brain confirmed what the parade was designed to prove. Titus was no longer a Roman official, no longer a person worthy of respect. He was something ridiculous and animal-like, someone who had reduced himself to the level of the beast. He rode through his own greed and dishonesty. The parade lasted several hours, winding through the Forum, through major streets, through neighborhoods where people knew Titus or had heard of his crimes. By the time it ended, tens of thousands of Romans had witnessed his humiliation. Titus was released afterward. He had not been executed or even permanently injured, but his social existence was destroyed completely. Everyone in Rome had seen him naked, painted white, riding backwards on a mule while braying like an animal, and covered in filth and garbage. Titus could not show his face in public without being recognized and mocked. People would point at him and laugh. Children would bray when he walked past, imitating the sounds he had been forced to make during his parade. Former colleagues avoided him. His family downed him. He had become a permanent object of ridicule, someone whose humiliation was so memorable and so complete that it defined him for the rest of his life. Several months after the parade, Titus left Rome, unable to bear the constant mockery. He was never heard from again. The mule parade and similar animal-linked humiliations served multiple purposes that made them effective tools of social control, despite their seemingly absurd nature. They punished offenders in ways that were cheaper than execution or long-term imprisonment, requiring minimal resources beyond the animal and the attendants to manage the parade. They provided public entertainment that was more humorous than horrific, allowing Romans to enjoy the spectacle without the disturbing violence of gladiatorial executions or public flogging. They created memorable spectacles that people would discuss and remember, spreading the message about what happened to minor criminals far more effectively than a simple announcement could. And they demonstrated that Roman authorities had a sense of proportion and even humor, that they could use mockery and absurdity as effectively as violence and fear to maintain social order. These various methods of public humiliation, from the tunic of shame and forced confession to the elaborate rituals preceding the culious execution, to theatrical executions and bodily violations, to servile ladder rituals and mock religious ceremonies, to posthumous memory destruction and animal-linked mockery, all served the same basic function. They punished individuals who had violated social norms in ways that were visible and memorable. They reinforce Roman hierarchies of status, gender, and power, showing everyone exactly where they stood in the social order and what would happen if they challenged that order. They deterred others from similar violations through fear and shame, making the punishment so horrible and so memorable that people would avoid the behaviors that led to them. They provided public entertainment that bound Romans together through shared witnessing of justice performed, creating collective experiences that reinforced community identity. And they demonstrated that the Roman state had complete power over not just the bodies but the identities, reputations and memories of everyone subject to its authority. Roman humiliation punishments were effective precisely because they were public, systematic, and designed to destroy honor rather than just inflict pain or cause death. A person who was beaten could potentially recover physically. A person whose honor was destroyed in front of tens of thousands of witnesses could never fully recover their social existence. They had been transformed in the collective perception of Roman society into something shameful, something less than fully human, something that would always carry the visible or remembered marks of their humiliation. Modern societies often believe they are more humane than ancient Rome, because we have abolished gladiatorial games, crucifixion, and public torture. We pride ourselves on treating even criminals with basic dignity, on having constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. But the psychological mechanisms that made Roman humiliation effective, the human vulnerabilities to shame and social rejection that Romans exploited so skillfully, have not changed over contemporary societies still use shame as a tool of social control, though usually in less physically brutal ways. Public exposure of criminals through media and internet platforms, mugshot websites that permanently display arrest photos, even for people never convicted, registries that track certain categories of offenders and make their information publicly available, social media campaigns that destroy reputations through viral exposure of misdeeds, public apologies forced on people who violate social norms. These modern practices are not identical to Roman methods, but they operate on similar psychological principles. Destroy reputation and you destroy social existence. Make someone an object of collective contempt and mockery, and you punish them more effectively than imprisonment alone could achieve. The question that remains is whether such punishments are just or ethical. Romans believed they were entirely appropriate. They believed that people who violated fundamental social norms deserved not just punishment, but humiliation. That destroying honor was an appropriate response to crimes that threatened the social order. They believed that the deterrent effect and the reinforcement of social hierarchies justified the cruelty involved. They believed that maintaining Roman civilization required these harsh punishments to keep everyone in their proper place. Modern human rights frameworks reject this view. We argue that punishment should not involve deliberate humiliation or torture, that human dignity should be protected even for criminals and prisoners, that there are limits to what the state can do to people even when those people have committed serious crime. We believe that rehabilitation should be possible, that people can change, that past mistakes should not permanently define someone's entire existence. But the tension persists in modern society. Many people still believe instinctively that some crimes deserve humiliation, that certain offenders should be made to feel profound shame for what they have done. When we hear about particularly heinous crimes, we often want the perpetrators to suffer not just imprisonment, but social death, permanent exclusion from normal society, lasting shame that follows them forever. The Roman methods may be too extreme for contemporary use, but the underlying logic that social death through humiliation can be an effective and satisfying form of punishment remains recognizable and even appealing to many people today. What do you think about these Roman punishments? Were they excessive, or were they appropriate for the crimes they punished? Were they more or less cruel than modern forms of punishment that involve long-term imprisonment in harsh conditions? Can public humiliation ever be justified as part of justice? Or should human dignity always be protected regardless of what someone has done? How should societies punish people who violate important norms without resorting to cruelty that might be worse than the original crime? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about honor, shame, and the ethics of punishment across time and culture. If you found this examination of Roman cruelty valuable, if you appreciate content that explores how ancient societies enforced power through psychological as well as physical means, then subscribe to this channel. We investigate the darkest aspects of human history with careful attention to primary sources and scholarly research. We ask difficult questions about justice, punishment, and the human capacity for cruelty. We explore how honor-based societies operated, how public shaming functioned as social control, and how the Romans perfected the art of destroying people without immediately killing them. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with people who want to understand ancient history, not just through monuments and achievements, but through the systematic cruelties that underpin those civilizations. The ruins of the Roman Forum still stand in Rome today. Millions of tourists visit every year, walking on the same stones where Marcus Livius was flogged, where Gas Publish dragged the Culius sack, where Davis was forced to climb the servile ladder, where countless other Romans were humiliated and destroyed before crowds of thousands. The tourists see impressive ruins of temples and government buildings. They hear about Roman law and Roman roads and Roman engineering. They learn about the greatness of Roman civilization, its contributions to Western culture and political system. But they do not learn about the humiliation rituals that took place in those same spaces, about the systematic cruelty that Romans inflicted on criminals and slaves and defeated enemies. They do not hear about the senators who chose death over living with destroyed honor, about the slaves who were crucified for minor acts of defiance, about the women whose virtue was deliberately destroyed as punishment, about the theatrical executions that turned death into entertainment, about the posthumous destruction of memory that denied people immortality even in death. Those stories are not part of the standard tourist narrative. They are not highlighted in guidebooks or explained by tour guides. They are not what people think about when they admire Roman architecture or praise Roman achievement. But they should be, because understanding how Romans used humiliation as punishment reveals essential truths about Roman society, about how power operated in honor-based cultures, about what humans are capable of doing to each other when social structures permit cruelty, and when honor is valued above mercy. The Roman Forum was not just a place of impressive architecture and important political speech. It was a site of systematic humiliation where thousands of people were destroyed not with swords and spears but with shame and mockery, and the deliberate annihilation of their social identities. That history deserves to be remembered and understood, not hidden or minimized. The stones themselves remember, even if modern tourists do not. See you in the next video.